Hello and welcome back. I'm Dan, the Neuroman May, and this is where we change the system. Nice to have you with me again, folks. So, this podcast explores neurodivergence, identity, creativity, and the systems we try to function inside. And this week, we are going to be focusing on neurodivergence in the workplace and what happens when it isn't designed for the way our brain works. Now, on the surface, work seems simple. We turn up, we do our job, we're productive. For many neurodivergent people, there's an invisible layer, and that's managing the environment, managing expectations, managing how you're perceived. Okay, so let's talk about meetings. Okay, so meetings aren't just about the meeting, they're about timing, tone, and reading the room. Now, as you know, or probably don't know, it is very, very difficult for neurodivergent people to read the room, to interpret the thoughts, feelings, and intentions of the people around them. Now, I've been victim to this many times. When I worked in insurance, we had to have several meetings about different things. And a lot of the time, call it plain ignorance, I just did not see the point of them. I just didn't think they benefited me in any way, shape, or form. My mentality used to be, can you just let me get on with my job? I'm not necessarily interested in the whole political side of insurance or the media side of insurance. I'm just here to earn money and go home, you know. But I couldn't say this outright to my managers and my peers because then I'd be perceived as difficult. And for neurodivergent people, meetings are a challenge because you know pretty much what they're going to talk about within the first 10 seconds. And that 10 seconds turns into 3 or 4 hours. And in that time, you're expected to take in a whole load of information that really deep down you're not interested in. And particularly when you have autism and ADHD, your brain goes off in different directions. So you're sat there, and I go back to the insurance situation, expected to listen to what's on the video about the latest talking points and developments in insurance. And all you're thinking about is, when can I go back to my desk? When can I go to the toilet? When can I have a break? When can I go home? Or I can't wait to go home. How long do I have to listen to this? Am I going to be expected to answer questions? Am I going to be expected to contribute in some other way, shape, or form? How am I going to cope with this? And unfortunately, it did come to an impasse at one point where I had clearly gotten burnt out by the amount of meetings we were having. And it was just before COVID. And we were sat in this tiny, tiny room. And there must have been about 20 or 30 of us cramped in. And one minute the room was hot, then the room was cold, then the room was hot, then the room was cold. So already environment's playing a big part in how I'm feeling at this point. So one minute I was alert, the next minute I wasn't. I was on the verge of falling asleep, really. And I'm sure there are other neurodivergent people out there who've been through a similar situation when they've been in employment. And it got to the point, from what I can recall, where there was the one guy on our team who just kept He was the one who kept answering all the questions. He was the one who always got it right every time and things like that. And I, without thinking, kind of blurted out, "Well, so far you've taught everyone in the room that we know explicit all." Okay, I'm editing that out. You can guess what the word was. And everybody just looked at me in stunned silence. And at that point, I didn't realise why they were upset, because it was just meant as a sarcastic comment. It wasn't meant to upset or offend anybody. And I knew that this other person would have took it in a light-hearted way, because I always knew that this guy had the knowledge of what he was doing and he was very good at it. Um, and I think looking back, what set me off was the fact that I had worked in it for another insurance company previously, and it seemed a lot simpler. You know, it wasn't as challenging as this other working for this other insurance company was. You know, in the first insurance company I worked for, literally, it was as simple as someone would call to report an accident with their car or a third party, for example. You would report the claim, send it away, and that was it. You didn't have to see the claim through yourself. There was no proper ownership. You didn't have to instruct solicitors, call brokers, instruct repairs. There were other departments that would do that. Okay. So at one point, I was actually the best handler on my team, because I was thorough, I was productive, my notes were very detailed. And then I went to this other insurance company and I was basically taught that I knew nothing. So everything that I was taught at the previous insurance company taught me nothing in this new one. So of course that's going to vent up frustration, isn't it? That's going to vent up um, bitterness. It's going to vent up, to some sense, jealousy, because again, it's the unwritten rules in the workplace, folks, isn't it? We're all taught to do things in a certain way, and suddenly what you've been taught is right is suddenly wrong. So your brain goes in this loop of, well, why is it suddenly wrong? It was right before. I was the best handler on my team at one point. And I remember having this conversation with a manager, and they said, things change, and I was like, well, they don't need to. I said, if something isn't broken, why does it need fixing? So again, it was trying to adapt, trying to adjust to the new routine, and it just wasn't working. Now, this insurance job was actually the longest job I'd been in. I'd been in it for 3 years, but a lot of adjustments had to be put in place. A lot of adjustments, and it did get to the point where my probation was extended and work arranged for a member of the National Autistic Society to come in and give me a proper assessment, but also give them training as well. Because it was clear to me that as an employer, they did not know how to manage neurodivergent people. They just didn't. You know, you ask a person if they, what do they know about autism? They'll say, oh, I know a bit. Oh, I've heard of it. But they don't know the ins and outs, the strengths and weaknesses, the triggers, because there's different levels of it. Now, I hadn't had my ADHD diagnosis at this point. This was back in 2018. So it was very, very difficult. And for the first 8 weeks of training, we were stuck in this room. And it was so difficult because a lot of information was being thrown at us at once. And no disrespect to the people doing the training, their presentational skills weren't the best. Sometimes you couldn't hear what they were saying. Other times you couldn't keep up with what they were saying. Some of them didn't have as much of a sense of humour, you know, because you need humour to get you through the day. You need humour to, you know, if you'll pardon the expression, lubricate the pains of the day, because it's long. It was long 8-hour days. It was like 8 a.m. till 5 p.m. And I not only had to get a train from where I live, but I also had to get an additional train and then walk to the insurance company where it was based. So I'm already burnt out before I've even arrived, you know, and it's a high pressure environment because you're constantly expected to answer phone calls. Um, you're not even really given enough time to go over your claims. You have to do it really, really quick, and then before you know it, your manager's prompting you, you're ready to go back on the phone when you're not, you know. And it was really, really difficult. And in a way, it's like conversational chess. Sometimes you're still learning the rules while everyone else is playing. You know, it's so difficult. And the amount of times I had to reassure my manager, I am not doing this on purpose. You know, I do not learn the same way as everybody else. It's not my fault you can't handle that, you know? Um, but yeah, it was difficult. And it did get to the point where I had to have a meeting with the general manager of the insurance company, who was above my manager, because it wasn't working. You know, I had to just say, look, you know, I do think employers need to be very wary when they take on neurodivergent people. Now, I think back then the term neurodivergent wasn't penned, but I said something along the lines of, you know, employers need to be more wary when they take on employees that have learning difficulties or neurological difficulties because their learning is not the same as yours. You know, the training was done very, very quick. I said, you know, we were stuck in a room for 8 weeks, you know, expecting to remember all of this training, and then suddenly we're shoved onto the floor expecting to be perfect. That doesn't work for everybody, you know. And sometimes I'd get the odd look as if to say, I don't understand why it didn't work for you, or the rolling of eyes. So it was difficult. It was really, really difficult. And it's not only the people, sometimes it's the environment itself, you know, open offices, which is where I worked at the time, you know, noise, constant input. And trying to concentrate can feel like reading a book whilst 10 radios are playing at once. Then there's the people elements. Now, a lot of the people on my team really were the polar opposites of me, and I always resented that my manager never put me with someone that I had more in common with. You know, not that I'm prejudiced or, you know, knocking people's interests, but if they don't interest me, I find it harder to make a connection. And I'm sure this is the case with a lot of neurodivergent people because I'm a self confessed geek. I like comic books, I like games, I like reading and listening to radio dramas, you know, old movies and new. That's my interest, you know? Whereas everyone else on my team, all they were into was football. Constantly talking about football. They would never shut up. You know, talking about a bunch of players that I'd never even heard of, um, talking about who scored what goal and who should do what to whom and which manager should be sacked. And again, this is the neurodivergence coming out. And I'm sure, again, a lot of neurodivergent people have done this. But it got to the point where I blurted out, do you guys ever talk about anything else other than football? And again, the whole of that section of desk just went completely silent. And I just said, I'm not being rude. I says, I'm just trying to make a point. I said, because that's all you ever talk about day in, day out. Football, 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 football. You know, and contrary to popular belief, not every male likes football. And what made me laugh at the time was that they all sort of looked at each other as if to say, well, what else can we talk about then? And it made me laugh because I thought, well, who's more autistic, you or me? You know, and it did get to the point where I had to have a meeting with the whole team, my manager included, because I think some of them weren't aware that I had autism or ASD, ASC rather, and some some weren't surprised, some were still okay. That explains a lot. Um, or I had no idea, Daniel, that this was how you were feeling. I had no idea this is what goes through your mind on a daily basis. I had no idea that these were the triggers. So yeah, it was incredibly difficult. And even though I stuck at that particular job for 3 years, it was completely the wrong job for me. Completely the wrong job. And a lot of jobs that I've had in my life have been the wrong ones, you know, which is what I'm trying to put a stop to at the moment. Um, because one can't carry on this way. It's not good for your mental health. It's not good for your self esteem. It's not good for anyone, because ultimately you're working in a job that doesn't stimulate you, that doesn't motivate you, that doesn't make you want to come in every day, that makes you want to go home as soon as you've arrived. And that's the biggest challenge, guys, isn't it? It's not impossible, but it takes a lot of effort for neurodivergent people. But it also takes a lot of effort for neurotypical people to understand us. Yeah? The social side, and this is what I was alluding to earlier when all they did was talk about football. There's the small talk, the office culture, the unwritten rules, something which always looms over us, the unwritten rules. And the reason that they loom over us is because they're not explained, they're expected. And that takes me back to what I said in my previous podcast. No one ever tells you that the rules have changed. You're just expected to know. And over time, that leads to masking at work. But the challenge isn't always the work itself, it's the environment around it. And when the environment fits, then everything changes. So, I hope you found today's podcast interesting, folks. And next week, we are going to be talking about why neurodivergent minds are creative. I'm Dan, the Neuroman May. And remember, folks, neurodivergence is our superpower.